5 ways to protect yourself from COVID-19. 10 ways to relieve stress during COVID-19. 5 ways to keep children learning during the COVID-19 outbreak. 5 ways to teach our children empathy during these challenging times. Lately, in these months, we've been barraged with articles like these, all focused on giving us tools for surviving and thriving in the pandemic. It can all be a bit overwhelming as we struggle to navigate a world that has been utterly transformed. What's a Jew to do? Fortunately, we possess a book whose purpose is to guide travelers preparing to enter uncharted terrain. Devarim offers us the last words of Moses to the Israelites as they camp on the threshold of the promised land, where they will face profound dangers, both external and internal. What wisdom can Moses offer them for their journey? In Parashat Vaetchanan, Moses urges the Israelites to keep the mitzvot. Shamor tishmeruna mitzvot Adonai Elohechem ve'edotav ve'chukav asher tzivcha. Be sure to keep the mitzvot, emphasizing shamor, to keep, with a verb in the same form, tishmerun, the laws and decrees that the Lord your God has commanded you. That would seem to say it all, summarizing the leader's charge to his people for their life in Eretz Yisrael. But then Moses adds something else in the very next verse. Ve'asita hayashar v'hatov be'enei Adonai. Do what is right and good in the sight of the Lord, that it may go well with you, and that you may be able to possess the good land the Lord your God promised on oath to your ancestors. What's the purpose of this extra instruction? One way to understand it is to focus on the phrase, in the sight of the Lord. That is, the people are commanded to do what is right and good from God's point of view, not what they believe to be right and good. In other words, we should not always trust our own instincts, impulses, and emotions, but should be governed by higher principles. Our senses can be unreliable guides to behavior. Just as the scouts were deceived by their eyes, returning a negative report of the land that undermined God's vision, we should be wary of our own perceptions that can mislead us. And so the third paragraph of the Ve'ahavta, which comes from the narrative about the scouts, instructs, do God's mitzvot, v'lo taturu acharei levavchem ve'acharei einechem. Do not follow your heart and after your eyes, which will lead you astray. Rashi, commenting on the phrase, do what is right and good in the sight of the Lord, offers a fascinating interpretation. Basing himself on a teaching from the sages, he says, Zo pshara, lifnim mishurat hadin. This means compromise, not strictly insisting on your own rights and acting beyond the letter of the law. This concept, lifnim mishurat hadin, comes to refute all those who would argue that Judaism is a religion of law while Christianity is a religion of love. Lifnim mishurat hadin refers to very righteous behavior that goes beyond what the Torah requires of us. Actions that are not determined merely by our legal obligations to one another. Those who act lifnim mishurat hadin do more than the minimum, treating others with more compassion and kindness than that which is required. And this behavior, this going above and beyond, says Rashi, is what's right and good in God's eyes. Here's an example of lifnim mishurat hadin behavior. The Torah teaches that one must return lost objects to the rightful owner. But in the Talmudic tractate Bava Metzia, the sages debate scenarios in which the finder cannot possibly determine the identity of the owner, and therefore need not return the lost object. For instance, if one finds an unmarked purse with no signs of the owner's identity, one can keep it. It's finders keepers in this situation. But what happens if the owner later comes forward and is able to point to distinguishing marks on the purse, proving that they are the owner? Shmuel teaches that in this situation, the finder should return the purse, not because the finder is legally required to do so, but because one should act lifnim mishurat hadin, beyond the letter of the law. The finder should always lean toward compassion for another over strict adherence to halakha. Another example, in Tractate Brachot, we read about the requirement that a minimum of 3 people are needed to recite Birkat HaMazon after a meal. If 2 of 3 have completed their meal, the third must stop and participate. But if only one person has finished their meal, the other 2 are not required to interrupt their meal to accommodate the one who wishes to recite Birkat HaMazon. Nevertheless, the Talmud relates that Rav Papa and a companion acted lifni mishurat hadin and interrupted their meal to allow Abba Marder to recite the blessing. So important are even these small acts of acting beyond the letter of the law, says Rabbi Yochanan in the Talmud, that the temple was destroyed because the Sanhedrin, the ancient judicial tribunal, adjudicated cases on the basis of Torah law, never veering from strict adherence to halakha. The sages refused to act lifni mishurat hadin, and thus failed to demonstrate the extraordinary compassion and kindness that God actually desires of us. Think about it for a moment. This is a shocking statement. In effect, Rabbi Yochanan is saying that the temple was destroyed because the judges were following the Torah too closely, adhering to the law too precisely, failing to go beyond what was required of them. This is a challenging, even paradoxical idea, that Jewish law actually requires us to go beyond the letter of the law, beyond itself. So we end up with a radical notion. We do what God expects of us when we go beyond the Torah's demands of us. The Torah's mitzvot given to us by God are not sufficient in God's eyes for a proper Jewish life. Throughout the book of Devarim, Moses implores the Israelites to follow God's mitzvot, to live their lives in the land of Israel based on the divine instruction they have received. But in Parashat Vaetchanan, we're reminded that above all, we must do what is right and good in the sight of the Lord. I understand this as a warning not to get too caught up in the details of halachic observance. If we do, we'll lose sight of what's most important, the overriding imperative to bring more goodness into every situation we encounter. God's voice champions chesed, steadfast loving kindness above all. We've all heard a lot about what is required of us in this challenging time as our country struggles to get the pandemic under control. Stay home, wear a mask, wash your hands, keep your distance. But what might it mean to go above and beyond what is required of us? With the stress of months of isolation and worry, we're all a bit on edge nowadays. Acting lifni mishurat hadin means extending an extra measure of patience and kindness to those with whom we interact, in person or over Zoom. We can try to listen more attentively, to be less reactive to perceived slights, less judgmental, more empathic and understanding, recognizing that everyone is doing their best in a very tough situation. We can look for small ways to be more loving to family and to friends, and make a special effort to show appreciation to those who are helping us, delivering packages, working the checkout counter, picking up our trash. We can find ways of showing gratitude, of course, to our health professionals that we know for giving of themselves so generously over these many months. And we can go above and beyond in caring for ourselves as well, trying to eat well and getting enough sleep, and reading something uplifting now and then, rather than immersing ourselves in the steady stream of bad news. Instead of castigating ourselves for our failure to be more productive, we can cultivate a kind and encouraging inner voice that reminds us to have hope. Law is necessary in any functional society, and following the rules these days will help to keep all of us safe from illness. But what sustains our hearts and our spirits is chesed, the quiet, steady effort to bring more goodness into the world in every way we can. Shabbat Shalom.